The winter front of the Second World War was not just a battlefield. It was a frozen gauntlet stretching for miles. Steel helmets turned brittle, rifle bolts froze solid, bread hardened into stone, and breath crystallized in the air before it could warm the lungs. There were nights when soldiers lay awake, not because of gunfire, but because the cold clawed through every layer of wool and canvas. Fuel was scarce, wood was wet, and the wind carried away heat faster than it could be made. They couldn't rely on roaring fireplaces or endless piles of coal, only scraps, discipline, and ingenuity. Inside half-collapsed barns, in trenches lined with ice, and under tarps stiff as boards, they learned to capture every trace of warmth. They insulated with materials no one would think of today. They built heat sources from equipment never meant for fire. They learned to stretch a single ember into hours of comfort, and to turn rations into both food and heat. These weren't ideas written in manuals. They were survival methods, born in the darkest, coldest hours, refined by men who had no margin for mistakes. And the surprising truth is, many of these same tricks work just as well inside a modern home. They require no electricity, no expensive gear, only the knowledge that once kept soldiers alive in winters where the cold was as dangerous as any enemy. If you want to hold the same skills that carried men through nights when warmth itself was victory, subscribe now. Number 1. Bread oven heat capture. In rural Europe during World War II, communal bread ovens were among the few structures still standing after bombings or military retreats. These ovens, built from thick stone or brick, were designed to hold heat for hours, even days after a baking session. For soldiers stationed near abandoned villages, this was more than a curiosity. It was survival. When locals had evacuated or rationing had emptied kitchens, the ovens often went unused for bread, but their design made them ideal for capturing and carrying heat back to quarters or makeshift shelters. After a day of baking, whether by civilians or by soldiers themselves, the oven's walls radiated intense warmth. The method was straightforward. Flat stones or bricks were placed inside the hot oven once the bread was removed. These stones absorbed the residual heat over the course of an hour or more. When ready, they were lifted carefully with cloths, sacks, or improvised wooden paddles. Once removed, the stones were wrapped in thick layers of rags, straw, or wool, whatever insulating material was available. The wrapping slowed heat loss, allowing soldiers to transport the stones to dugouts, barns, or tented positions. Inside sleeping areas, the stones were placed beneath bedding, near the feet, or beside walls to radiate warmth for much of the night. In enclosed shelters, even a few of these heat bundles could raise the ambient temperature noticeably. The beauty of the method lay in its efficiency. No extra fuel was burned solely for heat. The energy came from an oven that had already been fired for cooking. In conditions where fuel was precious and fires could reveal a position, this reuse of captured heat was both stealthy and resourceful. There were precautions. Overheated stones could scorch fabric or cause burns if touched directly, so careful wrapping and placement were essential. Moisture could also cause stones to crack when heated, so dry stones were always chosen for the task. Despite these small risks, the bread oven heat capture method became a quiet ally in the fight against winter. It required no metal stove, no constant tending, just the willingness to see a bread oven not as a kitchen tool, but as a heat bank. Today, the concept lives on in modern thermal mass heating systems, but in the war years, it was a soldier's way of carrying the day's warmth into the coldest hours of the night. Number 2. Fuel-drip tobacco, tin burners. In the freezing outposts of World War II, lighting a fire was never a simple decision. The glow could give away a position. The smoke could betray movement, and fuel was too scarce to waste on inefficient flames. Soldiers needed heat that was low, steady, and concealed. One of the cleverest solutions came from repurposing something almost every man carried: the humble tobacco tin. A tobacco tin was small enough to slip into a pocket, yet sturdy enough to withstand repeated use. With a few simple modifications, it could be transformed into a miniature fuel drip burner capable of providing hours of controlled warmth. The process began by cleaning the tin thoroughly and punching a small vent hole in the lid. Inside, a wad of cloth or felt acted as a wick. The tin was then filled halfway with sand or soil to stabilize the flame and prevent sudden flare-ups. The fuel, often recycled from vehicle maintenance, could be anything flammable but slow-burning. Kerosene, lamp oil, or even salvaged cooking grease was dripped onto the wick in tiny amounts. The drip system came from another container, sometimes just a canteen, with a pinhole, positioned above the tin so fuel landed drop by drop. When lit, the wick produced a small, steady flame that generated enough heat to warm hands, thaw rations, or keep a small enclosed shelter from freezing. The sand acted as a thermal mass holding residual warmth even after the flame was extinguished. This setup had several advantages. It burned quietly, with almost no smoke. It used minimal fuel, stretching supplies far beyond what an open fire could achieve. And because the flame was contained, it was safer in cramped, fabric-lined dugouts. The main limitation was size. It wouldn't heat a large area, but in close quarters, it could mean the difference between numb fingers and workable hands. In some units, soldiers made multiple burners and placed them strategically along trench walls or in gear-drying areas. Others used them to pre-warm canteens or cook small portions of food without the telltale smoke of a campfire. Today, the same principle appears in alcohol stoves and camping heaters, but during the war, it was born from pure necessity. A discarded tin, a trickle of fuel, and a little ingenuity turned a pocket-sized item into a frontline heater. Would you know how to make heat from the smallest scrap? Number 3. Heated ammo box radiators. On the front lines of World War II, ammunition boxes were everywhere, heavy, sealed, and built to survive the roughest conditions. Once emptied, most saw them only as containers for spare gear. But for soldiers facing long nights in frozen dugouts, these rugged metal boxes became something far more valuable, a silent source of heat. The method was simple but remarkably effective. An empty ammo box was cleaned thoroughly, its interior lined with stones or scraps of metal scavenged from the surroundings. The box was then placed close to a cooking fire, beside a field stove, or over a bed of glowing coals, never directly in the flames, but close enough for the contents to absorb as much heat as possible. The stones and metal acted like a battery for warmth, storing it deep inside their mass. Once the contents were heated through, the lid was sealed tight. The thick steel walls held onto the heat far longer than bare stones alone could. Soldiers wrapped the box in rags, spare uniforms, or a blanket to make carrying easier, then transported it back to their shelters. In the confined space of a dugout, tent, or barn corner, the box was set at the foot of bedding or along an inner wall. Slowly, it released a steady, comforting warmth into the cold air, often lasting deep into the night. There was no smoke, no light, and no telltale scent of burning fuel to give away a position. It was a perfect solution for troops who needed warmth without risk. Even better, the heating process cost no extra fuel. The ammo boxes were often warmed while food was being cooked, making the heat a byproduct of work already being done. Some soldiers found ways to extend the effect. Opening the lid slightly after several hours allowed the remaining warmth to escape more slowly. Others placed reflective panels, often made from scavenged sheet metal, behind the box to direct heat toward their sleeping space. In colder conditions, multiple boxes could be cycled between the fire and the shelter, creating a near-constant source of radiant heat. Though the warmth eventually faded, the system could be repeated endlessly as long as a heat source was available. It was a soldier's version of thermal heating, improvised, efficient, and made from whatever the battlefield offered. It was proof that survival in winter didn't always depend on new tools, but on seeing an old one differently. Would you turn a box built for war into a box that kept you alive? Number 4. Boiled cloth, draft stoppers. In the bitter winters of World War II, heat loss was a silent enemy. Soldiers could work for hours to warm a dugout or barn, only to feel the warmth vanish through unseen cracks in the walls or gaps around windows and doors. Every draft meant more fuel burned, more effort wasted, and more risk of freezing. The solution had to be simple, portable, and effective. And for many soldiers, it came from a surprising process: boiling cloth in oil or wax. The concept was born from observation. Ordinary fabric stuffed into a crack could block wind, but in freezing conditions, untreated cloth quickly stiffened, absorbed moisture, and froze solid. By boiling strips of cloth in linseed oil, paraffin wax, or even rendered animal fat, soldiers gave the fabric an entirely new quality. The fibers became water-resistant, flexible in the cold, and heavy enough to press tightly into gaps without shifting. Once treated, the cloth was pressed into seams between floorboards, jammed into window frames, or nailed along the bottom edges of doors. It created a seal that not only blocked the wind, but also trapped heat inside. In some dugouts, soldiers stitched these oil-soaked strips into long, sausage-like tubes, which they laid across doorways to stop cold air from creeping along the floor. The method required almost no specialized tools. An empty metal pot served for boiling. The heat source could be a small stove, a tin burner, or even hot stones dropped into the oil. Soldiers scavenged fabric from torn uniforms, old blankets, or abandoned civilian clothing. The oil or wax came from whatever was available, from workshop supplies to the rendered fat left over after cooking meat. It was messy work, and the smell of boiling oil clung to the air, and the strips had to be handled carefully until they cooled, but the results were worth it. A single treated strip could last an entire winter without freezing in place or letting drafts through. The heavier the treatment, the better it performed. And in the damp, windswept corners of the front, performance meant survival. This technique also had an unplanned advantage. The oil-soaked cloth was less appealing to rodents and insects, which meant soldiers could block holes without attracting pests to their shelters. In some cases, the strips were reused year after year, carried from one posting to the next as part of a soldier's personal kit. In the end, the boiled cloth draft stopper was more than just a trick. It was a lesson in sealing off the invisible losses that make cold so hard to fight. It showed that in war, survival wasn't only about generating heat. It was about keeping every scrap of it where it belonged. Would you know how to keep the warmth you already have? Subscribe, and never let the cold take what you've worked for. Number 5. Meat fat candle warmers. On the cold fronts of World War II, heat wasn't always made from wood or coal. Sometimes it came from the very food soldiers ate. In camps where supplies were stretched to the limit, even scraps of meat fat, something most people today would discard, became a source of light, warmth, and survival. The idea was as old as rural life itself, but soldiers adapted it for the front lines. Whenever meat was cooked, the rendered fat was carefully collected instead of thrown away. Once cooled, it formed a dense, wax-like substance that could burn steadily when given a wick. All that was needed was an empty tin, a length of cotton cloth, and enough fat to fill the container. The process was straightforward but required patience. First, the tin was cleaned and the wick placed in the center, anchored with a small bit of melted fat. Then the rest of the fat was slowly melted and poured in, surrounding the wick. When it cooled, the result was a crude but highly effective candle. When lit, these meat-fat candles produced both light and a surprising amount of heat. In small dugouts or enclosed spaces, even a single candle could raise the temperature enough to keep frost from forming on gear or walls. Soldiers would place them under cooking pots to gently warm food or near gloves and socks to dry them overnight. The heat was soft and constant, requiring no tending like a stove or fire. The smell was distinct, a mix of cooked meat and smoke, and while some found it unpleasant, Others saw it as a reminder of a hot meal. In desperate situations, the same candle could even be scraped down and used in cooking, making it both a source of heat and an emergency ration. This method had other advantages. The fat was entirely smokeless when burned slowly, making it safer in concealed positions. It could be made almost anywhere with minimal tools, and unlike wood or coal, it didn't require large storage space. Soldiers could keep several small candles ready in their packs, lighting them only when needed to conserve fuel. The main drawback was the fuel's fragility in warmer conditions. If temperatures rose too high, the fat could melt prematurely. But in the freezing winters of the front, this was rarely an issue. The meat-fat candle warmer was a testament to wartime ingenuity. It took something perishable and transformed it into steady heat, proving that survival often meant seeing resources in a completely different way. Number 6. Hay barrel, sleep chambers. In the frozen landscapes of World War II, keeping a soldier warm overnight was often harder than feeding him. Blankets alone couldn't stop the creeping cold, and fires were risky. A glow in the night could betray a position instantly. In some rural areas, however, soldiers discovered an unlikely solution hiding in plain sight: hay storage barrels. These large wooden or metal barrels, often used by farmers to keep animal feed dry, were abundant in barns, storage sheds, and abandoned farmsteads. Packed tightly with dry hay or straw, they offered a natural insulation that could trap body heat far better than thin bedding on an open floor. The idea was simple but highly effective. Turn the barrel into a personal sleeping chamber. To prepare one, soldiers would first check the barrel for pests or sharp splinters. The hay inside was shaken loose to create a hollow space large enough for a person to crawl into. Sometimes a canvas sheet or piece of cloth was placed at the base to keep hay from sticking to clothes. Once inside, the soldier would pull additional loose hay over his body, leaving only a small opening for breathing. The hay worked by trapping warm air around the body, slowing heat loss dramatically. Even on nights when the temperature outside dropped well below freezing, the inside of a well-packed hay barrel stayed comparatively warm, not from an external heat source, but from the soldier's own body heat being reflected back. The method had several advantages beyond warmth. It was silent, required no fuel, and could be set up quickly wherever hay storage was found. For soldiers on the move, it was an instant shelter that blended into the surroundings. From a distance, a hay barrel looked exactly like any other piece of farm equipment. Some soldiers made improvements to the design. A small piece of cloth over the breathing hole reduced drafts. In wetter areas, barrels were lined with waxed canvas or oiled cloth to keep moisture out. Others stored personal items within reach inside the hay, using it as both a bed and a hidden cache. There were limits, of course. Hay could attract insects or rodents if not checked carefully, and the method was less comfortable for those with allergies. In extremely damp conditions, wet hay lost much of its insulating power. But in the dry, cold climates where it was most often used, it provided a remarkable boost to survival. Modern science confirms what soldiers learned through necessity. Hay and straw have excellent insulating properties because of the air trapped between their fibers. During the war, this wasn't theory. It was a practical, life-saving reality. The hay barrel sleep chamber was a perfect example of soldiers adapting to their environment, turning the most ordinary object into a shield against the cold. In a winter war where every degree of warmth could mean another day endured, these barrels became more than farm tools. They became silent guardians of the night. Number 7. Heated shovel radiators on the unforgiving winter fronts of World War II. Every soldier carried a shovel. It was an entrenching tool, a weapon if needed, and a vital part of daily survival. But in the depths of winter, soldiers discovered that this simple tool could do more than dig. It could keep them warm through the coldest nights. The idea came from necessity. Fires were often banned or dangerous, yet the soldiers still had to heat food, thaw water, or warm their bodies. Metal conducts in stores heat far better than cloth or wood, and the shovel's broad, flat surface made it perfect for absorbing warmth from a stove, a bed of coals, or even heated stones. The process was straightforward. The shovel blade was cleaned to remove dirt or ice, then placed close to a heat source. In dugouts, it might rest against the side of a small field stove. Outdoors, it could be laid on top of hot embers after the flames had died down to reduce the risk of charring the wooden handle. Within minutes, the metal absorbed enough heat to become a portable radiator. Once heated, the shovel was moved to wherever warmth was most needed. Soldiers slipped it under blankets at their feet, leaned it against their sides while sitting, or rested their hands over it to bring life back to numb fingers. In some cases, it was even wrapped in spare cloth and placed between two sleeping men in a trench to share the stored heat. The technique had more than one application. Heated shovels could dry damp socks or gloves without scorching them, thaw frozen rifle bolts to keep weapons functional, or gently warm canned food without the smoke or smell of a fire. The portability made it especially valuable during sudden relocations. Soldiers could grab the shovel and carry its stored heat with them for several minutes, long enough to make a difference. Of course, there were precautions. Metal retains heat intensely, so direct contact with bare skin was avoided to prevent burns. The wooden handles were sometimes wrapped in cloth to protect hands when moving the shovel after heating. What made the heated shovel so effective wasn't just the warmth it provided, but its complete lack of fuel consumption beyond the initial heating. It could be reheated again and again whenever a heat source was available, making it a repeatable survival tool with zero extra supply strain. In field conditions where every object had to serve multiple purposes, this was a perfect example of adaptation. A shovel could dig, shield, chop, and now warm. And because it was already part of every soldier's gear, there was no need to carry anything extra. Even today, the principle remains sound. Modern campers sometimes heat metal plates or pans to create radiant warmth inside tents, a method that soldiers on frozen battlefields perfected decades earlier out of sheer necessity. The heated shovel radiator was more than a clever trick. It was a reminder that survival often depends on looking at the familiar with new eyes. In war, it turned a common tool into a lifeline. In peace, it remains proof that the simplest objects can hold the power to endure the cold. In the frozen silence of World War II, survival was never about comfort. It was about endurance. Soldiers didn't have endless fuel, modern heating systems, or backup supplies. What they had was resourcefulness, the ability to turn shovels into radiators, barrels into beds, and scraps into warmth. Every method they used was born from necessity and refined by hardship. There were no second chances for mistakes. The cold took its toll on the unprepared, but those who adapted, those who looked at ordinary objects and saw opportunity, endured. Today, most of us live in temperature-controlled rooms, a step away from heat at the flick of a switch. But if that switch failed, how many would remember what these men once knew? How many would recognize the value hidden in the simplest tools? These wartime heating tricks are more than history. They are a manual for survival when the systems we rely on no longer work. They prove that warmth doesn't just come from fuel. It comes from knowing how to keep it, store it, and protect it. If this knowledge fades, so does a piece of our resilience. Keep it alive. Learn it.